Everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us. It's so nice to see people coming in. I'm Esther Anatolitis, the Executive Director of NAVA, and this, of course, is the weekly NAVA Advocacy Program. We have been going for a good few months now. We have covered so very much, and we have been zooming into this moment, looking at this week, how to meet with a politician, how to approach a politician, how to refine your ask, and how to have that specific conversation. I can see a number of you are coming in. Please use the chat to let us know what country you're on today, where you are, to say hello. Thank you to Leah, NAVA's Communication Advocacy Manager, for posting the link to our live captioning there. And hello again to Helen, our captioner, who is in Brisbane. This session, as always, is recorded and live captioned. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to follow the audio of what we're saying. So please do click on the live captioning and you will see the words magically appear with thanks to Helen. We also record and we transcribe, and the sessions are available the next day on our website, where you will see all of the sessions that we have had to date. And hello to Kerry from Jaraway country in Toowoomba. Hello to Louise from Mianjin on Turrbal and Yagara country in Brisbane. I am on the lands of the Bunwarang and the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, Melbourne, where as you know, we are in different kind of stages of lockdown, and all working very hard to make sure that we all look after each other right now. So important. Now, Michaela is saying there is no sound for her at the moment. How is the audio for everyone else? Hopefully, yes, Michaela, it will just be a reloading, and hopefully that will be good. Anna Glynn says all clear. Oh, good. Caroline Phillips also saying good. Okay, good is good. Big tick from Ian in Sydney. Nice to see you, Ian. Okay, every week we do pray to the internet deities to, bring us together and keep us together for that period of time. And just before we switched the big live button, Helen was saying that she's had to travel from regional New South Wales to escape some floods. Let me introduce Helen O'Neill. Helen is a fabulous person, and we're going to have such a great discussion tonight. Helen is the chair of Performing Arts Connections Australia. She's held a range of roles that we're going to hear about in a little minute, and has also formerly been an advisor to federal Labor ministers at some very pivotal times in the development of Australian cultural policy. Helen, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you, and welcome to everyone. Looking forward to the discussion later on today. Yeah.
And Helen, tell us where you are and what country you're on this evening.
I'm in Canberra. It's Ngunnawal country. It's one of the meeting places for Ngarigo and Ngambri people, and it's also, of course, the head of capital of Australia, so the home of the Australian Parliament House as well.
That's right, where of course we would have been having our focus for Arts Day on the Hill on the 12th of August, only of course we now know that Parliament will not be sitting on that day. And of course we have been talking all year about how to continue civic engagement that is online, and so of course Arts Day on the Hill will go ahead on that day, and when we go into the workshop aspect of our evening this evening we will talk a lot more about that. So, Helen, so much to ask you. I see that Michaela has resolved the audio issue. That is fantastic, and hopefully everyone else can also hear us just fine. Now, there's a lot that I'm keen to ask Helen, particular because Helen has had a really interesting, impactful career across a range of arts roles, across roles where you've had, Helen, a really pivotal and long-term impact on the arts in Australia, and still do. Tell us about your professional trajectory and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, it's I started my professional life as a journalist with the Age newspaper, and I think because I'd studied 1 year of economics, I was a school leaver. I ended up on the finance pages reporting on the stock exchange, which I always thought I'd report on books and literature. So it's been set me on the pathway of being forced to look at the structures and financing as well as the actual content. But I also came from an arts family. My father was a book publisher. We had, as a family business, what was then the biggest independent publishing company. My grandmother was a musician. There were journalists all over the family. So it just seemed to be natural to gradually drift into those areas. But the transition point for me was actually going to the United States and doing a degree in public administration at the Kennedy School in Boston. And it was just when the digital world was becoming clear, and it was a year of the most amazing discussions about where bigger broadband would take us over the next couple of generations. So ever after that, I've been really so interested in the policy direction that underlies a lot of the change that's overcome our cultures as the technology roars on. So I worked for the ABC after that in policy, and then worked for Kim Beazley when he was Minister for Communications. And my job was to look after pay TV, the introduction of that, and the Australian content rules for commercial television. So that took me further into the arts world. I left broadcasting on a whim. Adrian Collette asked me to go into the opera, and I worked marketing comms there. And from there, I helped set up AMPAG, the Australian Major Performing Arts Group, which was a group around a funding mechanism, really. The 29 companies that get maligned all the time for being too big all had the same funding mechanism. So they needed an advocate that understood that mechanism and also what the content was to basically speak the truth to the Australia Council. And that I spent 7 years developing that. A lot of it was about funding increases, but also about actually giving arts companies autonomy and not to just speak as grant supplicants saying thank you very much for the money, but also being able to argue their case. Let's skip over some of it. I worked for other ones also, always on those intersections of where the change was happening in policy as the arts took a prominent place, as Australia built its national identity, Australian voices, but as technology was upending how we actually did it. I worked for Simon Crean as his advisor and came up with the Creative Australia Cultural Policy, which was really looking at the whole field of it, from digital games through to community arts projects around people's personal well-being. How do you wrap that all up in the 20th century when most of the mechanisms we got were set up in a completely different world, and indeed in Australia that was not confident in its own identity and particularly its multiple cultures. We can talk about Creative Australia later on, but it was a fantastic experience of being able to understand the brilliance, the dynamism, the factionalism, the occasional frustrations of what it takes to have a set of national cultures coming together around this thing of what it is to be creative in Australia. Since then, I headed up the British Council in Australia, which is an enormously brilliant organisation around shared values in culture. It's very specifically not about cultural diplomacy, it's about relationships. And Performing Arts Connections, if I could finish up there, is an organisation made up of venues around Australia and touring companies. So we have about 240 members, of whom about 130 would be venues anywhere from Karratha through to the Opera House, from Hobart's ancient Theatre Royal to a couple which are being built as we speak. And then there's about 60 or 70 touring companies, which again range from a one-hander through to children's, through to Bangarra and Bell and the ones you know so well. I should finish up on that because I'm actually getting on in years and I could go on for a lot longer.
And I should note that in the group this evening, we have Catherine Connor, live from Perth, who is the CEO of Performing Arts Connections Australia. So hi to Catherine. Now, so much to ask you, but the very first question I'm going to ask you, because chat will scroll it away from me and I will forget to ask you, is that Anna Cordingley is asking about the painting behind you. She says the painting behind Helen is smashing. Please have to find out its artist before the session ends.
Oh, it's Ken Wisson, and that's my personal talisman. I will not live in any premises which doesn't have that painting. It's called Dawn in East Melbourne, and it's wonderful to live with.
It really is. I mean, it's just so intimate, and it's that sense of the very personal clutter and sense of home. I love it, and I've had the joy of getting to appreciate it in person. And Adam, you are correct. And Nadia is saying, nice pick, Adam. There you go. And Catherine saying hello, and greetings from the lands of the Whadjuk people. Good to see Catherine Connor. So that description, Helen, is just, and I'm now just reflecting back on Mark Textor's description last week of what led him to where he is, Nicholas Picard the week before. It's very much that parallel with Nicholas around background in the media, not unlike my own, and that sense of, that analysis of, what are the issues, how do you represent a range of complexities? And then as you're describing ANPAG, which as many of us know, that they've announced that they are folding this week to make way for the inevitable new advocacy voices that emerge. But Helen, the way you just characterised that is a real kind of, you've clearly had a strong focus on, I guess, the set of principles that bring together the way that sectors or subsectors of an economy, of a community work, particularly the way you're articulating that relationship between technology and technological change and cultural production and, a sense of identity and so on. This, of course, right now is a time of enormous change in ways that we weren't expecting, and in ways, I guess, that bring forward, as we've been discussing in previous weeks, it exposes certain structural inequities.
Yes. Yeah.
It also exposes, some of our frustrations and shortcomings in not feeling as heard in the arts sector. But then every sector of the economy is needing to be heard and represented right now to make sure that we get through this, really well. What are the kinds of things?
There's one thing on that, though.
Yes.
Basically, the arts often is the bellwether. It is the one that shows up the problems coming up, and it's happened again. And here, an example back from the midst of time, when I was at the Opera, our ticketing systems were still, they were computerised but not connected to the internet. So we had an email ticketing system. And I said to someone in the then Minister's office in Canberra, we're making money off internet bookings. And they didn't believe me. But it was because ticketing for live performance led a lot of the software development for distributed data networks in actual commercial applications. So they did start listening when I think News Corp developed a system for sale that was ticketing for everything from zoos to community theatre. But I think it's happening again. You just look at what skills are needed to combine live performance, live communications with recording, and that's where the arts is right now. And everyone else will have to be there. Our experiments in it are crucial. And some of them work, some of them don't, but that's the arts.
Yeah, I think that sense of being a bellwether is hugely important. There are areas in which the arts is fragile, and there are areas in which it's agile, and the ways in which we're adapting, I think, are super interesting to watch. But then also the ways, that what exacerbates that digital divide is a huge frustration. If you were in a policy or advisory role at the moment, what are the kinds of things that you would be emphasising?
Very good question. The first thing is who's going to survive. Not everyone will. So I'd be asking people like Catherine and a number of the other ones, who are the groups, the individuals that must be looked after at a time in which you can't help everyone. And that means that ministers and Australia councils and Screen Australias have some hideous decisions to make. It's not so much that artist against that artist, it's what is going to be able to pick up and run at that time, whether it's 2 months away or 6 months away, and really go with it, and what's needed in the structures around them. Most other people, some of them will just have to shut down their studios or their production for a while and then maybe come back in through another way. But basically, what is the bedrock for the future is just one of those hideous things that governments are going to have to look at in the short term. Who do they call on then for that information? And I think that's where we are at the moment. What figures, what surveys, who do you trust to analyse the information is the sorts of things that a minister would have to be looking at. And as we all know, many of our structures are run down.
Indeed, yes, and many organisations whose role it is to perform that sector strengthening and sector developing function are also, of course, not so well resourced, and really feeling that pressure right now. But it's such an important thing that you raise, that in a time like this, the question should be around, okay, well, what constitutes the arts ecology? What's the essential infrastructure?
Exactly.
What needs to be bolstered at all costs? But instead, there's been a lot of, please give us your impacts, let's understand things, and then maybe not so much. And I should say, zooming out to the whole community economy, etc. I'm seeing at the federal level a lot of just almost sort of flailing about trying to understand, well, how do things actually work?
Yes,
what are
exactly.
the industry interdependencies? Why is this minister not speaking to that minister, etc.? So, when things are ticking along fine, apparently, you don't tend to think about what are the structural issues, what are the inequities.
Well, I don't think that many governments at state or federal level have grasped that as funding has been cut back, just how good the arts have been at working their way around.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
they haven't actually realised the impact of the funding cutback. So now it's exposed, they're vulnerable. And so to take another APAC example, we went to see the Minister for the Arts, Paul Fletcher, to tell him that unless theatres, the presenters, have enough capital to buy shows, it's not much point the Australia Council funding them to make shows. So these connecting points. And then also there's been a lot of emphasis on artists, which is quite correct. At the start of the pandemic, what else could we do except support these individuals and small organisations so hit? But now we have to bring our audiences into it. Now, who knows about the audiences? So PAC knows. It's their venues that speak to them, that sell them a Magnum at interval. And so bringing those sorts of relationships into the understanding with politics has been much neglected in recent years as the funding's retreated. So I do think, yes, what does the minister worry about? Well, who knows what, and just what's drifted away in the years in which they put the arts in the bottom drawer or whatever the folder is on your computer desktop.
Let's expand on just that, because of course this crisis, as we've been saying quite a lot in the last couple of months of our program, this crisis comes at a time that is hardly a rosy time for the arts in Australia. First of all, with large parts of the country, we've been through the fires and floods and toxic air and so on of the summer, so we were already depleted and struck and traumatised in many cases. And then, of course, in the last 5 years, there has been a significant depletion of arts investment at the federal level, following the extensive national consultations and investigative work that led to the National Cultural Policy of 2014. There was drastic and unexpected disruption of arts policy at the federal level, and then a decline ever since, while at the same time, as Shelley Hinton is pointing out on the chat, unfortunately, the arts are so good at working on the smell of an oily grease rag. And so now we're in a situation where we're wanting to build good long-term relationships with all sides of politics. We want to be able to go in and speak to an MP about what the issues are. And as we've been learning over the weeks, a lot of MPs are not so connected with what arts issues are. They're not hearing about it a great deal from within their electorates. They're certainly not hearing about it from their political colleagues, and they're not seeing it expressed as a priority of their side of government. And so we've been zooming in on how can we become better advocates? How do we look at what's needed? How do we engage with the media? How do we look at policy? And then how do we engage politically? So let's talk now very specifically about relationships with MPs. What, in your experience, is some really, really crucial first steps? And then we'll get into some details.
Okay, so working for a minister, we would have monthly calendar meetings. Who should the minister meet with? There would be typically 250 requests in. Some of them are compulsory. Some would be stuff that the minister's deeply interested in and would say, no, you can't do that. The priority is this. So first step, you've got to have an invitation to the minister's office. There's an appointment secretary who's probably the most important person in the office because he or she manages the minister's diary, why you want a meeting and who you are. So the questions really, even just to get in through the door for a face-to-face meeting, the minister will want to know, who is she? What does she want? Why? And can I do anything about it? Just a sort of little bit of that in an invitation says, yep, this is one for this minister at this time, and they have a voice that you need to hear. So that's the thing to get in. So a crisp thing, and when an appointment secretary comes back to you, please treat them with respect. They really are make or break for a relationship. They tend to sit straight outside the minister's office, and if they don't like you, actually, you're not going to get a meeting. I'm joking about that a bit, but they're really valued members of any ministerial team.
And so hard pressed. I mean, if you've got that many incoming requests and you've got to, try and I imagine there are many people who get in touch and feel that they are very important and, have a very demanding kind of approach. Just a very
including
quick
the minister's children and parents. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
A very quick question on precisely that. Kerry McKenzie is asking, what percentage do you think would be new meetings or new contacts in those monthly calendars? So what proportion of new people are they meeting with, do you think?
Every week there will be new people. When you come into the portfolio, who are the main pressure groups, stakeholders? So you're going to run through the 5 or 6 of them, which in the arts, obviously screen producers, in the old days, AMPAG and PAC probably, and NAVA. So you would expect to see them maybe once a year, once every 6 months, depending on what policy work is going on. But there are always new ones because these meetings are a really quick way for the minister to pick up new information, not necessarily data. The meetings are usually 20 minutes to half an hour, but just what's going on. So if you can come into a meeting with, here's the point, I'm in here to discuss this, and this is why, very quickly, that's a really valuable thing for the minister. So yes, lots of new ones, but you do have to make that first grade of saying why and who you are. The next part of that would be, once you have a time, brief the department. You'll probably get called by the department anyway, it's their job to come up with a brief for the minister. Brief the minister's advisor. Same points again. Who are you? What do you want? Why now? And is this, what can the minister do in particular? And put it on one page. You could maybe go over one paragraph. Send it to the office so the minister can have a look at it before the meeting starts and relax. And they can look at you then in the meeting and actually ask you to tease out your argument or give you some more information rather than having to go through it from scratch. And then look at the minister. He'll want to know who you are. Because the other thing about meeting with MPs is that 90% of them are gregarious extroverts who have got to this place in life by talking to people. So look at them, let them see your face, who you are, your body language, and then they can gauge who you are. They're good at it usually, I mean, with some exceptions, but most of them are pretty damn good at sort of summing up whether you're a player, basically. Can you deliver on what you say as well? Because, remember, politics is really different groups coming together to share out resources or create new resources by some form of collaboration. I mean, that's essentially what Parliament is. It is a collaborative mechanism to settle disputes. And that's, if you can help the minister sort of get to that point, to feel that there's a conversation and room for movement, it makes a really big difference.
Now, just on that, and that kind of that sense of getting in there and being really clear, I just want to tell people a little story. The very first time that I contacted Helen was I had only just started in my role as Director of Regional Arts Victoria, so it was nearly 10 years ago. It was less than 10 years ago. It wasn't. I'm making it sound much older, but it was. It must have been 2012. Helen was working in Simon Crean's office. There had been a delay in the announcement of the Regional Arts Fund, and my colleagues from across the country were saying, oh, there's artists who are waiting to know this. And I said, well, has anyone rung the minister's office just, say hi and, these are the issues? Or, no, we haven't. Oh, okay, well, why don't I do that? And rang Helen, explained the situation, and you straight away said, can you just jot me down on less than a page what the issues are, what the consequences are if that announcement is not made soon, and what needs to happen next. So I then did that, and I think, and of course the decisions had been made. It was just a matter of making sure that it could be announced in a timely way. Helen and the team achieved this in less than 2 days.
Yep.
And it was partly Helen had not been hearing from colleagues.
I didn't know that was the problem still, and it should never have been a problem, but you can fix them. Not all of them, but fix them. I can just say something on this chat thing about picking winners.
Yes.
What I'm saying about this is, for instance, I'm using PAC examples because I've just got it in my head at the moment, but there's plenty of other ones.
Yes.
If you don't get the touring mechanism right, it's not much point having a competitive grant round with some people winning grants. You've actually got to get the ecology, the marketplace, whatever, the connections right. And the trouble is we're all being trained into a competitive grant round and then grumbling about the results because so few win. Getting the minister to understand what is essential, the mechanisms, the ones that can support smaller organisations in their wake or be as a hub, is really, really important. So we've got to snap out of let's just make the next grant round bigger. There's far more important things to do. Well, that's important too. We need more funding. Don't forget about that. But there's got to be other stuff happening at the same time to allow the interactions and to get to the audiences. Not just say that company survives or that one doesn't. That's not relevant.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for clarifying that, Helen. And in response to Rob's question, I think it's very, and this goes to something we've picked up on a few times over these months, but Helen's just put that in such a clear way, that yes, absolutely, more arts funding is needed, but then we also need to strengthen the infrastructure, the ecology, the what makes things possible for everyone. This is something that is insufficiently understood, and we see that now in the government's response to COVID-19 for the arts, that there isn't a great understanding of how artists earn their incomes, of the casualisation, of the essential interconnectedness, the issues with local government and universities, the the big drop in payroll jobs, the impact of something like JobKeeper. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of just articulating what actually constitutes the industry, which is separate to a conversation about the value of the arts, which is something we started to chat about when we were doing our pre-chatting just before we joined you all. And Helen and I were just about to have a discussion there about the difference between advocating for the value of the arts and then those other more specific, perhaps more forensic questions. So Helen, tell us about tell us your position on advocacy about the value of the arts as opposed to those other specifics.
Now, this is something that's been cropping up for decades and decades and decades. So back in my parents' time, a whole lot of effort went in through the 60s around forming an Australian national identity using our culture. Now, that became the way to what is needed to fund that formation. So there's a clear goal for the arts. Everyone, I think, in their heart of hearts knows the arts have value. Some think it has more than others. But it's really hard for an MP to go past, my kid's choir's really good, but what's that got to do with me? So when we put that argument, it's sort of like, well, I've got to worry about the roads. So we've got to actually put it in a thing where what is valuable about the arts can help us deal with this, or it relates directly to a program on a minister's desk or to a local MP's constituency problem. Like many local MPs advocate for a new theatre in their electorates, and many of the newer theatres in Australia are because their MPs decided it was time for a performing arts centre or a gallery in their area and lobbied funds. So that thing of just saying the arts are valuable to us all and everyone needs creative self-expression, you know that, I know that. Most MPs would have an inkling of it, but just want to know why it's on their desk today. So you've got to ask for something, and then you can relate that back to the value of the arts. And if it's a problem they have and the arts can help solve it, terrific. But you've got to tell them how, make the link really specific. So arts and health, which is an issue which has stopped and started and stopped and started for many years now, I think it's one with enormous opportunity now, but we're going to have to come up with a program that they can understand, see worthwhile, and they know that we can manage it, I think. And that's, again, about a trust, developing the relationships.
And there's lots of arts and health, arts and mental health, arts and resilience conversations happening at the moment, including things like the National Arts and Wellbeing Collective and the Creative Recovery Network, who I believe that the Creative Recovery Network, does anyone know, I think they have just received, did they just receive 4-year funding from the Australia Council, or have they just lost 4-year funding from the Australia Council? To one or the other, massive difference there, but very, very important that they are supported.
In the New South Wales bushfire areas, we look with such envy at that Creative Recovery Network over the border in Victoria. If that could become a national program, that is a really good advocacy ask.
So that's
exactly the sort of thing that people can grasp, and you can work out how much funding is needed, and with any luck, the arts people involved won't ask for too little.
Yes, also a very important point, not asking for too little. I believe the Creative Recovery Network is national, and the Arts and Wellbeing Collective in Victoria is, that's the collaboration between a few different organisations, which sounds really fantastic. Let's go back to that question of the difference between that broader sense of value and the and asking for those specific capacity building structural issues, because one of the problems, of course, that we have with the evolution of arts policy the last few years is that at the moment, federally and through the Australia Council, there are no programs and there are no funding avenues for organisations who are, capacity building sector service organisations. They're having to compete with organisations who, create art and run galleries and so on, which makes it very difficult when you're a peer assessor and you've got these competing things, and one is, artists who are incredible and need support, and the other one is the one that makes all of that possible. What is it about, do you think, this particular moment with different understandings that government is developing through the pandemic? Is there a particular moment here where we really can look at proposing really good, ambitious programs that build on exactly that really develop these lasting infrastructures?
Yeah. I'm going to digress just very quickly for a moment. Most of you who work in regional areas would know this even better than I, but the Australian Council is irrelevant to much artistic work in this country for a variety of reasons. They don't fund theatres, they don't fund community arts. Most visual artists don't have the time to apply for Australia Council grant. So I do think actually one of the things is a strong department at federal level and a really strong state and federal plus local government group to swap their knowledge, because they're all funding different bits, different levels of the arts. And if it's just the Australian Council, they wouldn't have a clue how half the arts actually operates, because people do not apply for them for grants and they don't fund other parts of it. So that's one thing. Then this question of service organisations against individual artists. Well, of course, the Australian Council should be funding more individual artists. That's where terrible cuts have just changed the careers of nationally prominent artists or people who are on the road to having a career that stretches across the 25 million of us, not their own community. But that question of the hubs, the mechanisms, whether it's for touring or just basics like insurance, like the programs that NAVA offers, they're the ones that, as the grants have been cut back, everyone just tries to forget about and hope they get funded somehow. Philanthropists keep bobbing up with some things, but as we know, most philanthropy programs either around projects, they're firm about the long-term build, or alternatively, they'll do things like build a gallery or fund a prize. So a lot of what government's been doing in recent years is just saying private sector will do that. What we've got to do is bring it back to, again, should government be funding hubs, service organisations that then help a much larger group that will never go near an Australia Council grant funding one, but might go to Create New South Wales one, or, I don't know, the Stonington City grants program down in there. But the hub is the one that links it nationally, internationally, down to the local area. If we can get that argument across too, it will make everyone's life easier, right down to the grant assessors in the Australia Council.
Oh, it certainly will, because it's them that's in that turmoil of thinking, how do I decide? How do I decide? Let's continue that contrast then between artists and organisations when it comes to meeting with MPs. We've got a couple of questions from the group. So Daniel Butler is saying, when artists are meeting with MPs, what is the ask? Going into a meeting with an MP and asking for more money isn't a productive use of time for anyone. And something that we've been hearing from MPs across the last weeks, and particularly for MPs who are not ministers, is that they really enjoy to meet with people in their electorate. They really do want to engage with and understand. So what are the priorities, Helen, for artists who are meeting with their local member or maybe their senator?
Okay, really interesting question now that Arts Day on the Hill is not going to be up the hill, up from my house.
It's going to be everywhere instead.
Yeah. Okay, so I was thinking this a lot. If it's a minister, you've got to go through the whole appointment secretary and things like that. But if it's your local MP in your area, why not go to see them in their office? Or even better, bring them into your studio, invite the local paper and the MP and say, look, we can do something that we're, got a new show coming up, or to the local theatre, or in my area, southeast New South Wales, there's starting to be some live gigs in some of the pubs. Invite your MP and make sure that you get onto their office every few months and say, we've got this coming up, we've got that coming up, we'd love you to come to any of them, but this might be the one when you're in town, not in Parliament, and just get them out to see the work and meet the people, particularly your buyers or audience or something like that. And they can just see what the life is in the community. It makes a huge difference. A couple of examples for me is the recently retired Mike Kelly from the seat of Eden Monero. He's 6'4" and huge. So you would see him at the Narooma Oyster Festival or the Four Winds Music Festival from, 100 yards away, and he would always stop and talk to everyone. Now, he was a bloody good local MP. If you can encourage your local MP to do that, saves you a lot of time and trouble when, developing all that professional advocacy and coming up with a whole new policy one, but will make life easier for people like Esther or Catherine, who then have to go and do that top level lobbying. It makes so much difference. And I was thinking
really
there's so few electorates that don't have events like that you can invite your MPs to. I was thinking like Josh Frydenberg. So I looked up where his office is, and he wants to hear from his constituents. Well, I can remember doing my school play up at the Arts Centre around the corner from his office. So parents of people doing youth drama in that area should be on to Josh.
Oh, yes. His office is also in prime real estate for the commercial gallery sector.
Yep. Yeah. So he should be asked to every opening, but ring him up and say the one you need to be there for this year is in a non-sitting week in Parliament, and we'd love you to be there. And then make a big song and dance about it. Get a photographer in, put on your webpage, and it really makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, so many of them will have personal connections to things like when I worked for Simon Crean, I had no idea till I started that his mother was the person who signed the cheque for the Blue Poles painting. His father, and his mother unveiled it because his father had been treasurer. I didn't know that his mother used to look after out-of-work painters in the 50s. So he was taught to draw by Peter Booth, who, is in every gallery and a thing like that. So you've got to ask them, you've got to develop the relationships with them. So Peter Booth, to an MP back in the 60s, is an important part of his career. I mean, he's probably taught him to get out, deal with people that he normally wouldn't, and it's on both sides. That's the really important thing about it. So, yeah, have a go at all of that, and it's easier than you think and could be good.
I think that's a really crucial point, that it is easier than you think, that MPs in their electorates get a lot of approaches, including from, different kinds of citizens' actions groups who are really worked up about this thing in particular. And as Helen was saying earlier about let them see you, what's your demeanour, what's your approach. Politicians, especially at that local level, are hearing from a lot of really aggrieved, inarticulate people who need to get their point across as well. But how fantastic to be the artist who is not only offering, a moment of bigger, broader horizon, but is orienting their work to that bigger national picture. I think that's really crucial. We have recently, through the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Contemporary Arts and Culture, have put out a survey to MPs to understand their arts connections so that we can draw on that and use it to help foster those connections on Arts Day on the Hill, which of course will be happening, as Kerry McKenzie points out. There are a lot of hills in Australia. It will just be elsewhere as opposed to there in Canberra. Now, we've got just over 15 minutes left, so do please keep asking questions of Helen. There is, so very much to ask. Let's now get really specific about the kinds of meetings and asks that are really effective. And Helen, if you've got some examples from any point when you've been in those kinds of roles, and without naming people, if there have been any particularly memorable meetings because they were great or because they weren't great. So any kinds of examples or case studies that you can offer us.
Okay. Two ones, both for Simon Crean, Kim Beazley, Rupert Murdoch. Okay, we were shut out of the room.
Tell. Oh my God.
Just hugely traumatic for everybody.
Oh.
But you used to come into Canberra once a year. Now, he always got a meeting when he asked. But that's just one of the realities of Australian life that we all have to deal with. The good one, First Nations person coming in, talking about going on to the Australia Council, back in the days of art form boards and stuff like that. Someone came in, you probably guess who it is, had a backpack and a bottle of water, sat down and said hi, and started, listen to the minister listened to them, and by the end of it, the appointment was certainly going to go ahead, but it was just a really refreshing conversation. And that was about taking this stuff seriously, not expecting First Nations people to behave like corporate suits. And that person made the case without saying a word, just came in ready to go with lots of really concrete stuff to say, but an engaging personality too. Bad ones. Really senior group in the screen area. Early on in the ministry, three big blokes, get red in the face, many lunches. Deal makers, like serious people, came in and talked non-stop for 20 minutes. And then, the next meeting had to start because many meetings and parliamentary sitting times are 20 minutes. They left. And I'm sure they all went off and started talking about, I said this and he was... And the minister just turned around and said, why were they here? Because they'd not actually got round to the point.
Wow.
And he'd just spent 20 minutes of a really long day full of big decisions to make and not understood why they wanted to see him. What was the point of it? So that was also a personality thing to a certain thing, that whole body language of we're here because you need to hear our voice but we know you're concerned with this issue because that's your job is a really good thing there. Also asking for stuff that's almost impossible. Now I'm going to be very brave here. NAVA always used to ask for legislative change. That's really hard and it's going to take 18 months to 3 years. If there's another way of solving a problem, that's a good thing. And if you do want legislative change, make sure you're in for the long haul and not promising your membership problem solved in the next 2 months. So it's...
Or longer, says Penelope, our general manager and soon to be acting CEO. That can take a very long time.
Yeah.
And I think it's, those changes can be very impactful. But where there's regulatory, where there's issues that are about the way government departments work, where there are other areas. But sometimes, if that really is the change that we're going for, to know that it takes time. Yeah,
that's right. And you might have to be calling in outside help. Now, I, for some reason, didn't manage to turn off the chat, so I can see another one about
okay. Yes, so there's
arts.
So Anna accordingly would like to know Helen's opinion about the role of our major performing arts companies during this time of building. Mary Jo Capps, who is the chair of AMPAG, the Australian Major Performing Arts Group, did suggest that the decision to close AMPAG had been coming well before COVID, but it does seem to Anna that the cost of putting on a major performance and the requisites for massive audience capacities to watch those works means that the small to middle tiered companies should be stepping into the void. Is this the moment for the behemoths who absorb most of the funding to step aside? And before Helen goes into an answer, Mary Jo Capps, as chair of AMPAG, has been leading a process for about 6 months now or more. Yeah. So it does, in fact, more than 6 months, it must be a year. So it predates COVID because the Major Performing Arts Framework no longer exists at the federal level. And so the funding mechanism that Helen described earlier no longer exists as what unites those companies. And there have been a lot of small to medium voices in those conversations, in including PAC Australia, I'm sure. So Helen, what are your thoughts on those next steps?
Yeah, this has been a really tricky one. I know when Catherine and I have been talking about it, so it's not just the 28, 29 counting circa companies funded under those 4-year mechanisms, it's all of them now are on a 4-year cycle. And so basically what we have now is a set of multi-year funded companies, many of them in the performing arts, not so much in visual arts and literature areas and the digital arts, and project funded companies. And that might be a useful way for people to actually think about it, because some of what we call small to medium are actually quite large. In fact, they're very large. And if you start thinking about venues and theatre, art centre producers, you're actually breaking up the old structure of everyone was sort of like a Sydney theatre company in miniature. So there was a big one and a small one. I don't think that's true anymore. So we have to take that into account when we're looking at the groups. But the other problem that we all face is that of that big group, 6 of them were symphony orchestras, and they took most of the grant money. And in comparison, the stuff that went to theatre companies and to dance was minuscule. So what we're going to have to think about in this next stage is, what do we do with the orchestras and that vast sum of money, which is essentially artist salaries? So when we're saying take it away from them, we're actually, in a funny way, and this is very hard for me to deal with, saying there's probably about 800 artists who are funded in the symphony orchestras, maybe 900. So we're going to take away the funding from those 900 and give it to other ones. Well, I don't know what the answer to that question is. It depends on the audience and what the relevance of the quality of the artwork is. And also, they're probably better paid than most other artists. But that's the sort of issues that will float up in the next few years. And then if you look at a big theatre company, they're essentially box office funded. I mean, that's what drives them. There is a crucial amount that they get funded for, but really they're funded by their audiences, with state government providing the platform on which they perform, whether it's the Sydney Theatre or the Opera House. So we actually have to think about that too, about what is box office funded, what is subsidised so that we can innovate or reach audiences who can't afford. And in fact, before this, I was thinking, well, what changes can you make? I mean, perhaps we should be subsidising ticket prices so that some people can go to the Opera House and see a small company perform there, not only one that's can fill a 3,000-seat concert hall or something like that. There's all sorts of ways you can think about it. Not much of it's going to happen in the next couple of months while we just try and survive, but has to be on the agenda in the future. And for visual arts, you know, what do you do about building national collections as against dealing with, you know, the people with small studios on the cultural tourism trails who just need help with a bit of cash flow to get through until people start travelling again?
Yeah, thank you for setting it out that way, Helen. I think a lot of the times, we don't, those with the longer memories or who were involved in these those changes, it's important to remember that that funding level for those major performing arts organisations, particularly the orchestras, predates the Australia Council, and those orchestras were once employed by the ABC. And it was, a shift of cost from one government department to another that meant that we now have this enormous imbalance when we look at the overall quantum of funding at the federal level. And of course, the problem being over the years that imbalance has never been corrected. There hasn't been then an influx of other money which can go towards those supports and those other things we've just been talking about for a whole lot of other sectors. Let's have a look. There are a couple more questions just in the few minutes that we have left. I think they're more just comments. So Josie Howlett's saying, excuse me, it seems to Josie that the government has a very narrow idea of what constitutes the arts. So how do we change that situation? so the funding does not just go to big symphony orchestras, etc. And I guess that's our broader question about our ongoing advocacy and the way that we position the industry, isn't it? What Helen was saying earlier about those connections between the arts, the broader creative industries, what the arts means and is.
Yes, it's and interesting into the digital one. If you were an academic writing a paper, you would probably say that sometime in the next few years, Screen Australia and the Australia Council will overlap so much that they come together. But at the moment, pretty hard, because Screen Australia's got a commercial culture while the Australia Council's got a grants culture. So there's some big questions there. But in the meantime, that classic thing of only dealing with the short term, the Opera House has got a concert hall, and there's a big subscriber audience for the orchestras. So that's what drives the revenue into there. What happens next with digital presentations and the stuff going to the small studio around the side and all that sort of it is perhaps where we should be looking for some really exciting things that just become essential for how we talk about things. Contemporary music is obviously well along this route here, and I think out in the regions, contemporary music is in the performing arts centres and sort of intermixed with the theatre and the cabaret shows as well. So much to think about and do in the next little while.
Oh, yes.
While things are opening up, so long as we can just help people get through.
Yeah, well, that's right. Caroline's saying she has to go. Bye, Caroline. And Nadia is pointing out something which is increasingly going to be a focus for the Australia Council now, which is that if those major organisations want to keep that level of funding, there should perhaps be stronger directives for them to commission new work from Australian producers of diverse backgrounds, or to collaborate with other parts of the sector. And that's certainly where the expectation is going.
Yeah, really interesting. Again, just thinking and preparing for this, those issues that my father and grandmother dealt with of what is Australian, what's our Australian music, what's our Australian literature, what's our Australian painting, sort of went away, and we've had to deal with enormous issues about colonialism, about what is really the meaning of diversity, which we're still dealing with. But in the end, we're going to have to work out what our identity is as Australia is in this highly complex world. And actually, maybe it's time that the cultural policy sort of helps us find the language and the way of reaching those discussions in. There you are. There's an optimistic thing too.
Oh, God, yeah. And as we've been saying, as all of us in all our various contexts the last many months, this is absolutely a moment for, as those structural inequities exposed by the crisis, of making sure that those other issues, those strong diversity of voices comes forward, and that we don't go back to a sort of a snapping back to an old normal. But we're actually refocusing in ways that are really crucial.
Yeah, that's right, because our great brilliance is providing the platforms not only for opening up and revealing new voices, but also helping people talk to each other. So that's the essence of coming up with that identity that does bring us together with some sort of shared story. That's the cultural task.
Yeah. Well, it is almost time for Helen to leave us, but this has been super illuminating to have some great specifics on what's going on from the minister's side when you're requesting a meeting, and the other pressures on their calendar and their diary, the difference between having that more direct and conversational relationship at the local level and inviting your MP to things, and those specifics around, crafting that ask and being very, very strategic. Just seeing Oh, it's probably just a comment there from Craig Fossey about the Australia Council finding that strength away from government and remaining a relevant advocacy body for arts and culture. It's a complex one for the Australia Council. I know there are people within the Australia Council who, yes, focus really intently on advocacy, but it's difficult to be an advocate within an arm of government, isn't it, Helen, depending on what we think advocacy is?
Oh, I think you can give it a go.
Well, everyone, in using our text-based clapping and thanking, please join me in thanking Helen. It's been so fantastic to get to spend this hour with you. Thank you so much again.
Total pleasure. See you all soon.
Thanks, Helen. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And now it's bye to Helen, and we continue with the next workshop part of our conversation. But that was super great to hear all of her perspectives. Who's got now some specific questions about anything that Helen has said so that we can unpack that a bit before we go into some of our specific things about Arts Day on the Hill, which is already the week after next. And next week, we're going to do a lot of focusing on exactly what we're going to achieve on that day. I was particularly interested I've just been comparing back, listening to what Helen was saying, comparing back last week, listening to Mark Textor describe his personal and professional trajectory, and then the week before, listening to Nick Picard talk about his trajectory. And it's interesting that, you know, all three of them were involved at different times in different ways in explicitly political roles, but none of them set out to do that. They all talked about, you know, not having, you know, that wasn't, you know, they weren't members of political parties. They weren't engaged in that at a young age, but they each developed, you know, different strategic approaches to what's needed for, you know, a particular entire sector, and then how to approach that through the roles that they've had. Some of the roles that that Helen has held include, as well as being the founder of AMPAG, she's also the director of CHAS, the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, the director of the British Council in Australia, and yeah, a range of other roles that look, you know, sort of really broadly at different aspects of policy and strategy in the arts. So now, since last week, who has had a go at connecting with their local MP? I'm hoping that some of us have already and have been using the guides and the toolkits in a good way. I can see a few of us typing, and I will go and open up the toolkit. I must say my internet connection is so much better since that upgrade. I was so worried about our sessions previously. I'm going to do a bit of a recap of what we've covered so far, and I want this to be a chance for all of us to ask and raise any questions from a range of things that we've talked about, because next week when we get together, we're going to make some really specific plans around Arts Day on the Hill. And as you know, we are hoping that all of you will apply and register to be one of our specific advocates or media spokespeople for Arts Day on the Hill. Thank you to Leah for just posting the link to the to part 4 of the Advocacy Program handbook. As you know, these workshops are presented free for everyone, but the resources that we develop are for NAVA members only. And becoming a NAVA member is super easy. It starts from $7.50 a month, which, as I have mentioned many times, is the cost of maybe a couple of coffees a month, or one very expensive coffee if you live somewhere in inner city Sydney. So it's something which is a great investment in the development of your career, as well as, of course, in the building up of that focus and skill and critical mass of advocacy together. So as people are thinking of questions across anything that we've discussed, I'm just going to take us through a recap of our program so far, and then we'll look at some of the tools for this week. Now, Michaela Nutt, who is in Luton in the UK, has got a meeting with her MP tomorrow. It's an interesting one, she says. She wrote to her, and then she wrote to the Secretary of State in the UK. They wrote back with a rather standard answer. So we're meeting tomorrow to discuss what I would specifically lobby for next. Really pleased with that. I need to spend some time reflecting on our concerns and refining our concerns into clear asks. Thanks, Michaela, for sharing that. And it goes to what Helen was saying about when you put in a request to a minister, a number of things happen at that other end. They do get in touch with the government department, sometimes with the Australia Council, to ask for a brief. And several people may contact you to put that brief together. And when you work in roles like mine, you're so used to developing that brief that you actually write that for the government colleague before they've even contacted you. Adam Simmons is saying he hasn't hassled his federal MP recently, waiting to hit her with the news about Arts Down the Hill, but have interacted on social media. Oh, good. And have had recent congratulations from a state MP refunding. Have replied and will follow up. Oh, good. Especially when you have those, those engagements and that unsolicited yay and congratulations. That's so super important and a great opportunity to build that relationship. So let's look back on the advocacy program across the time that we have been together and look at the zooming in that we've been making to get towards not just a day of impact for Arts Down the Hill, but the kinds of skills that we want to keep developing and building into something that is ongoing. As we said right at the outset, that is not just once off and not just in an emergency, but something that lasts and something that builds a number of relationships well distributed all over the country, so that people who are in Parliament are hearing from artists, from arts audiences, from our sector on a regular basis. And when issues arise and the Arts Minister is trying to strong-arm the front bench or talk to backbench colleagues about what's needed, they're able to say, right, yes, of course, I understand that because so-and-so met with me and I've been to their studio and I've been to numerous places and I really, I get this. I've got that direct knowledge and experience. So we started out in April looking at what advocating the arts during this complex time looks like. We heard from Alex Marsden from AMAGA, the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, and from Anne Robertson, who's the director of the Public Galleries Association of Victoria, but is also a member of the National Public Galleries Alliance. And at that time, the crisis was still fairly new. I think by that point, I'm just reflecting back on my paper diary here. That was week 6 of the crisis, the 22nd of April. And we were talking about the challenge that we were facing at that time in measuring the impacts of COVID-19 on artists, on the sector, and then in communicating those impacts, we were just starting to find out then what the blocks were, what the issues were in the colleagues who were contacting not having a good grasp of what constitutes the ecology, what are the supports, what are the issues, what are the infrastructures, how do artists work, how do artists earn their incomes, etc. the next week, on the 29th, we recapped last year's Arts Down the Hill and introduced the NAVA Advocacy Framework. And we also heard from some of last year's Arts Down the Hill advocates, including Gadigal Wurundjeri Yuin artist Nadina Dixon and Hobart-based artist Linda Carvalho. And we talked about what happened last year when, of course, we did meet in Canberra for a couple of days, did some workshops, held an event, and then met with MPs. The week after, we heard and learned from two of Australia's leading First Nations advocates. Nadina Dixon, I have been in MP meetings with this woman. She is clear and formidable and approachable, and she's just, I don't know if anyone on the call has been in a meeting with Nadina before. Please share your experience if you have, but Nadina is particularly fantastic at just connecting up her personal experience, her family experience, her day-to-day experience, the realities of being an artist, being a work in a number of different ways, and here's what's needed policy-wise. She draws those connections so well and comes from a family of activists, and is just someone that I really admire. Similarly, Wesley Enoch, who you may have heard a story about earlier. He is a member of the NAVA board. He's the artistic director of the Sydney Festival. And many of you will know he's been co-hosting the First Nations roundtables that the Australia Council's been presenting on Fridays, but also someone who has a very clear and compelling way of articulating issues in a way that yet connects what you'd think of perhaps as the drier policy side of things, and also the dignities of supporting First Nations artists and communities, the way that supports and dignifies all of us. And it's just such a powerful way of redressing inequity in the way that he speaks. We then had Q&A with a politician. Each of our 4-week blocks have culminated in a 4th week where we actually get to hear from a politician. And of course, when we do hear from politicians, it's a very different kind of language. I'm not sure if everyone remembers hearing from John Alexander and the ways in which he, of course, connected the arts up with what he knows best, which is sport and elite sport, and also regional touring and the place of galleries in regional towns and so on. Although that is a passion of his, he was also able to draw connections between that and what other MPs are often interested in. And we also heard from two consultants who work with politicians in very different ways, Zoe McKenzie and Darren Rudd. And I remember some great discussion in particular about what Darren was saying about the way that very, how do you describe them, high-powered, high-paid lobbyists engage with MPs, and that expectation there and how they step into meetings and work differently. We then looked at a few weeks of understanding policy development. One of the great frustrations that we often have is, where does the arts even sit at the moment in terms of policy priorities? And in particular, as we saw late last year with the arts having now been rendered invisible in terms of the name of its portfolio, it can be difficult for those within government to even understand where the art sits. If you're a backbencher and you've got a lot of things on your plate and you're not seeing a portfolio that is clearly designated around arts and culture in all of its, complex and important issues, then it can be really difficult, to get that in terms of what you're contributing to more generally. We heard from John Daly from the Grattan Institute, who brought some, really great and kind of forensic looks at ways that policy development works, in particular around some of the challenges in representing the scope and the scale of the arts industry or arts and culture or the creative industries, and some of the challenges in quantifying that sometimes. Global comparisons, we heard from Dr. Jackie Bailey, who's about to do some work with the Australia Council and looking at the whole sector in the next couple of months. And Jackie had done some really interesting work on global comparisons right now, and that understanding of, okay, what can we learn from other countries and how they value arts and cultural policy in terms of what they are contributing and prioritising right now. And I'm just scrolling back in the chat because there was a comment about this earlier, comparing to France. So Josie Howlett pointed out that Emmanuel Macron has spent $11 billion to support the arts during COVID, and had asked the question of what's the biggest roadblock in getting politicians to show a real and genuine interest and commitment to arts funding, especially at the moment. I would be really curious to know everyone else's responses to that question. I'm going to try and see if I can copy and paste it so that it comes back to the bottom. I don't want to pin it because then we'll lose the... here we go. So there is the question. What do you think is the biggest roadblock in getting politicians to show a real and genuine interest and commitment to arts funding, especially at the moment? Please use the chat to give your responses to that, and we will discuss that in a little minute, because I think it's an important question to be posing. So where does policy sit in the arts in Australia at the moment with John Daly? How does it sit globally? And then what are some of the challenges of achieving policy impact from within an invisible portfolio? And we were very fortunate to have the time of Mike Murdoch, who had been the secretary of the former Department of Communications and the Arts, and through the Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, whose work I still quote on a regular basis, including in the piece in The Guardian yesterday. Mike and the team were working on one of the answers to that question, which is around the relationship between creative skills and the way that we nurture artists and creativity, and the future of work and the shape of the new economy as technological change accelerates. And Mike also talked about how interesting it would be to have a productivity commission investigation of the arts and a sense of, you know, what actually constitutes the industry, because as we've been saying quite a bit this year and since that week, there is not a great understanding among government, but nor is there a holistic understanding in the sector. You know, there isn't a particular organisation whose role it is to provide that insight. And then again, we wrapped it up with Q&A with a politician and heard from Maria van Vacuno, who has spent a career focusing on cultural diversity and community development. And she talked about cultural policy and a culture portfolio. So it's a very different question to creative industries. And that kind of portfolio approach that is about identity, that's about community organisations. It might also be about things like sport and public space and urban and regional development and so on. So after understanding policy development and looking at advocacy for the arts, we then spent 4 weeks looking at the media. Because to be engaged in advocacy, we need to have a sense of what the issues are. We need to have a sense of how policy is made or not made. And then, of course, a lot of this plays out through the media, the ways that we engage with the media, the ways that the media connects current issues and brings them to politicians' attention. And then, of course, the way that politicians use and manipulate the media in different ways. We heard from Michaela Boland, who is one of the most senior arts journalists in Australia. And as we have unfortunately since learnt, with the cuts to the ABC, Michaela's role is due to be made redundant. And I encourage everyone to contact the ABC and let them know just how important arts coverage and critical arts journalism is, and in particular because it is part of the ABC's charter to do just that. It's very, very disappointing, particularly considering everything we talked about that week. We then heard from George Megalogenis, one of Australia's foremost political journalists and explainers, and looked at, what connects or disconnects politicians from the day-to-day politics of remaining engaged in the arts. We then had a kind of extended case study in looking at that question of how to be a media spokesperson. And Abdullah was generous enough to take us through what was a really terrible and trying time for him when some of his work was the subject of political manipulation for political gain. And that was and then supported by a range of people in the sector, including Jane Morey, who was then NAVA's publicist, and looking at what the steps were there, which was a frustrating but also illuminating time to see that we often feel that the arts should be more powerful, and then we realise just how important it is to politicians who feel so threatened by the power of the artist in engaging audiences with works that recompose our emotions and our responses to things and the way that we understand key issues, traumas, relationships, etc. Then we wrapped up again with a Q&A with a politician and heard from Adam Bant in terms of relationships with the media, looked at some of the challenges in delivering campaigns. He talked a fair bit about, going and meeting with an MP and, in a sense, challenging them with the kinds of impactful campaigns that we can put together if they don't respond favourably to what we're putting forward. And this goes again to that notion of the critical mass of the large number of us across the country that we really need to build and make best use of. And then understanding the politics, and we've just had our great few weeks here of hearing about how those who work directly with politicians, how those various interfaces between public sentiment, publicly focused politicians, the political cycle, etc. works. So in response to that question of getting politicians to show a real and genuine interest, Nadia Odlum says that rhetoric that the economy comes first, which positions art as something extra or a luxury, is a big roadblock. Arguing for art's inherent value or even its current and potential contribution to the economy is difficult during recessions and with conservative governments. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because if we're arguing for the value of the arts right now, we would be in the same, pile as everyone arguing for the value of education, the value of tourism, the value of et cetera, et cetera. So needing to be very specific is hugely important. Wu Wen Yu is saying, I didn't send out my letter to local MP in Taichung. It was about the lack of government spending on more diverse cultural expression. Instead, while I was investigating what activities are available in public spaces, I joined a local choir I like this very much as an act of personal agency. Sometimes the best way to express your voice is to train your voice with other people and to find that strength together. And to be part of a work. I think that's enormously important. Singing and dancing are very important to me culturally in terms of my background, but also as a means of expression. I've been doing a lot more of both these last months. It's very, very important. Nadia adds a point to hers that as an add-on to her roadblock, she would say that one week there were some interesting strategies suggested about pairing our advocacy approaches with other sectors, for example, tourism. Yeah, and I think, Nadia, in coming months and years, we're going to see a lot more direct collaborations between industry bodies and other sectors, and that's going to be absolutely essential. Yvonne East is saying it's a time when we feel like being insular. What we need to do is get communicating and out there so that politicians will feel like they will get credit for being forward-thinking and creative by supporting the arts. That is a very good way of putting it, Yvonne, and pretty much sums up the entire advocacy course that we've been talking about over the last few months. That sense of, and I think Nicholas, it was Nicholas, wasn't it, who talked about legacy, and that just by some coincidence, when he had been, I think he'd said that pretty much every time that he'd been a ministerial advisor, whether it had been at state or federal levels, it had been at those last stages of that particular government's term, which of course they didn't quite know. There are elections, but there's a sense that people get. They look at polls, they look at public sentiment, and there comes a time where politicians are very interested in legacy, and the arts is hugely important there, where if it comes to things like what Helen was saying about opening theatres, but also having that long-term cultural impact. And so, yes, we do want to be insular right now, but we do need to get out there in numbers, in large numbers, and make best use of both, our online technologies, but also those of you who are in states where you can actually go and have a meeting with a minister. That is very, very important. So this takes us to Arts Day on the Hill and the plan for next week. Arts Day on the Hill is the week after, but next week we're going to be going through our plan. And what we're going to do, of course, is have a largely online day of advocacy focus using the hashtag Arts Day on the Hill, and a focus on a particular critical mass time of day, which is question time. If Parliament was sitting, question time is between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. I'm sure you've all watched this at different times, where you've got that really weird, frustrating experience of watching politicians just yell at each other throughout the House that we just saw the graphic of, the House of Representatives, and that'll be a particular moment of critical focus for us. However, those of you who are in states where you can go and meet with an MP, this is a time to be requesting that meeting on Wednesday, the 12th of August. Now, we're going to give a lot more advice and support to everyone who is engaged in and is registering for Arts Day on the Hill. Leah, could you please post that link to the page on our site where we're encouraging you, please join us as an advocate or as a media spokesperson. The only difference between those two, thanks Leah, the only difference between those two is that if you're keen to also speak to the media, we will do an additional workshop, Bring Back Jane, hopefully, and that will be Monday week, I believe, that we will get all that information out there. Our aim, of course, is to build a really, really great critical mass of advocates. And as we've been saying all year, really effective advocacy for the arts is not just about you know, those structured meetings with MPs. It's not just about those briefings. It really is about those ongoing conversations that you have, about being constructive and compelling. Is a particular kind of leadership that speaks from where you are right now, that is full of confidence and positivity without being you know, unrealistic. But that's about telling a particular story from your point of view that is so compelling that it inspires someone to tell that story again, whether they agree with you or not. We see examples of this online, on social media, all the time. Adam says, should we be trying to request meetings with MPs now or wait till more specific messaging from NAVA? Absolutely, be requesting those meetings now that we know that that sitting week is not going to happen and they will be in their electorate office. You've got a lot of information in this handbook, also on the Arts Day on the Hill page on our website. We will get some specifics out next week as well, but of course it is now the week after next, and given the Prime Minister has changed things up by yes, no longer being in Canberra that week, absolutely, Adam, and thanks for asking, do request that meeting with that MP now and say that you're one of the many artists across Australia who's participating in Arts Day on the Hill, and that you'd like the opportunity to introduce them to your practice, either meet with them at their electorate office or you know, invite them to your studio if that is something that you can do. And don't forget the Australia Council Electorate Profiles tool, where you can select the drop down there and choose your electorate, and then you'll get and here's where that is, you'll get all of this information that can also help to structure your meeting request. But most importantly, you know, you explain who you are, that you're in the electorate, that you've been, you know, keen to meet them, or that you've already got a sense of their background and who they are. And you're looking forward on that day to together being part of the national event that is Arts Day on the Hill. So this time next week, we're going to go through that in much more detail. Do please join us. So there's that link there. You've got till Friday. Of course, everyone can and will take part, but if you register and let us know a bit about you, we will have that confidence that we've got a good spread of people. We need more people from Western Australia and the Northern Territory. So if that's you, then be sure to join and spread the word. And all we're going to ask of you on that day is to be engaging directly with your MP, to be sharing things on social media, and to be expressing from your unique perspective what is needed for the arts right now. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Helen, who's been doing that great live captioning, so useful. And we will see you at the same time next week for the NAVA Advocacy Program Arts Day on the Hill session. Let's get ready. Let's do this, everyone. See you next week. Have a really, really great week and stay safe. Bye, everyone.